Dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Dimitris Gintidis. I am currently a member of the Greek chairmanship of the Council of Europe press team. It is my pleasure to welcome you as moderator to the fifth part of the discussion series organized by the Greek chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Tonight, we will be discussing with Benjamin Haddad, Director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Hi, Ben.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, Ben, is currently one of the top political analysts on EU politics and transatlantic relations. He is actually in a very privileged position to offer his insights on the workings of European integration and structural changes in European societies from the outside, located in DC and in close contact with social and political developments in American society. He recently authored Le Paradis Perdu, l'Amérique de Trump et la fin des illusions européennes, published at Grasset in English, Paradise Lost, Europe in the World of Trump. At the same time, social movements and demands for racial equality or democratic freedom in both continents are equally present in his writings. This constant focus on the dynamic intertwinement between everyday politics and international relations render his perspective in tune with the Greek chairmanship's concern to bridge the gap between normative discourses and developments on the ground regarding the state of human rights and rule of law today. Therefore, before we begin with our discussion with Ben, I will pass the floor to the Chair of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe and alternate Minister of Foreign Affairs, Miltiadis Varvitsiotis, for a few brief introductory remarks. Minister, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you once again at the fifth round of this series of the Greek chairmanship of the Council of Europe in discussion with. Today, after many and significant participants, we have the pleasure to welcome Benjamin Haddad. Mr. Haddad is a strong voice that supports the relations between Europe and the United States, that believes that the transatlantic tie should go without any impediments in the future, and definitely he is a great advocate for the European unity and efficient collaboration between North America and Europe. He hasn't been afraid to take a public stance in support for democratic values, rule of law and human rights whenever these are in danger. And therefore, that makes him an excellent speaker and for this series of events. The pandemic brought to us many assumptions that we had in the past. And fundamental freedoms have been seriously affected. Therefore, there is a need in order to renew our faith to these human rights that they were affected through the pandemic, and to highlight the importance of values as the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Therefore, I think that Mr. Haddad, who wrote a renewed political liberalism and addressed the issue more like a pragmatic than a philosopher, a pragmatist that touch upon practical issues that have to be addressed, presents one of the keynote speakers that will give us the chance and an opportunity to revive our approach for these democratic institutions. I think that throughout this series of discussions we try to highlight in the pluralism that different voices bring in our political and social discussion. And therefore, I would like to thank Mr. Haddad for accepting today's invitation. With him will be Dimitris Kididis, a political scientist who is a part of our press team in the chairmanship, and I hope that they will have an interesting discussion that we all will follow through this web conference. Unfortunately, throughout the chairmanship, we didn't have a chance to organize many events in person. Nevertheless, we tried through this new media to attract more and more attention from people who interest to find a new point for thinking for their future reference. Thank you all, and I wish you a good discussion and a good follow-up.
Thank you, Minister. Ben, let's go to your recently published book. By stating that we are living the end of our European illusions, you offer a formidable yet very pragmatist view on global politics. This is very different than what we were accustomed since the early 90s. I'm talking about the then euphoria of a new liberal order. Does this end of illusions entail a paradigm shift as to how we should reimagine Europe and its position in the world?
Yeah, thanks, Dimitris, and thanks for having me today. First, I want to say a quick word because it's really great to be able to speak with you at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. You know that Greece is a really important country for us at the Atlantic Council. We deeply believe in the US-Greece and US-European partnership. Obviously, our mission is US engagement with allies, but we really put a special emphasis on the bilateral relationship with Greece on both obviously the security and defense dimension, and Greece being a key actor in NATO, the trade relationship and Greek leadership in the Western Balkan, in the Eastern Mediterranean, having a very good relationship with Prime Minister Mitsotakis that we hosted at the beginning of the year 2020 before the pandemic, and we've seen and been impressed with his leadership in dealing with the pandemic, and also with great support from the terrific American ambassador in Athens, Jeff Pyatt. So yes. I first wanted to say how much I appreciate being with you today.
Thank you as well.
On your question on the book, yeah, I think the reason why I wrote this book is because I do think that Europeans have to think about the world differently. I think that the European Union is an incredible success, especially when you look at what happened before on the European continent. But it was built, especially, if you look at a French perspective or German perspective, Western Europe, it was built as a way to transcend power politics, to transcend, I would say, even politics, which has conflict at its heart, to build an organization that's built on law, rule of law, in win-win trade and economics. And I think right now we're seeing that what's working well for our continent is not necessarily the rule in the rest of the world, and that the rest of the world lives still in a world of great power, from the United States, especially under Trump. When you look at increasing Chinese assertiveness all across the globe in the South China Sea, but also the way China weaponizes its own economic investment as a tool for political influence. When you look at the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the pattern of Russian aggression in the last 15 years. And of course, we could talk right now about Turkish action in the Mediterranean. And so I think that doesn't mean that this is a book that's both a book of analysis, but it's also a book of an activist, or someone who is deeply pro-European, and I admit it, but it says that Europeans need to take their destiny in their own hand, need to be more comfortable speaking the language of power without giving in, without giving up what makes the originality of their model and their identity, but also understand how the rest of the world functions. It's a book that was written in Washington, and I think that's also a key part. I arrived in the United States 6 years ago. I saw the end of the Obama administration. I've seen the Trump administration. And of course, the styles, the personalities of the two men are extremely different. But when it comes to the relationship with Europe, I think we can see a pattern. We can see a progressive shift away of the United States from the European continent, an emphasis also from both President Obama and President Trump on the question of burden sharing and Europeans stepping up for their own security and defense. You know, Bob Gates, who was President Obama's first Secretary of Defense, left in 2011, giving a very tough speech on European defense, saying, you know, our children won't want to die for the European continent if you are not able to make those kinds of sacrifices. At the end of his term, President Obama gave an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. It's a pretty remarkable article called The Obama Doctrine, where he calls friends in the UK free riders of American power. And so, of course, the tone is quite different and much more hostile when it comes to President Trump, but the emphasis on Europeans stepping up is the same. And, you know, we just had a debate a few months ago, on U.S. withdrawal of troops from Germany. And of course, the way it was done, the uncoordinated and unilateral manner in which it was done by this administration is problematic. But if you look at the trend over the last 25 years, it has been a trend of progressive withdrawal, whether it's Republican administration and Democratic administration. Right now, we're going through a presidential campaign. You know, candidate Biden, Vice President Biden, has put the rehabilitation of alliances at the center of his discourse. And I think it's really important if we work on issues like climate change, if we work on the global response to the pandemic. But the US is also going through a lot of domestic challenges, from a major economic crisis, obviously, that we're all going through due to the pandemic, racial and identity issues, social tensions. So I think a lot of emphasis will be put on rebuilding the US economy and reconciling Americans. So once again, when it comes to the Mediterranean, when it comes to Eastern Europe, North Africa, I think European, or the Middle East, if you look at Syria, Europeans will, to a large extent, have to take their destiny in their own hand. And I also think that would actually be a very positive evolution for the transatlantic relationship. So my book was to try to explain the evolution of U.S. foreign policy without the drama and the scandals and the tweets, but try to look at the deeper trend and make a case for Europeans to assert their power on the world stage.
Okay, I hear you. And what I find really interesting is that you are taking a long-term perspective, a macro perspective. And in this sense, we could also throw into the discussion the pandemic that we are going through, and perhaps move away from the sensationalism that we always like to indulge ourselves with, and see perhaps that the pandemic actually accelerated processes that were already underway. The cases of lagging economics, protectionism, securitization, what you mentioned regarding the withdrawal of certain large powers from certain parts of the continent, and the emergence of some other powers. So these trends, you say, were already evident before the pandemic, right?
Yeah, well, so I think, as you said, I think right now, even though we're still in the pandemic, especially in the United States, we can already see some trends, and we can see that this has been an accelerator of pre-existing trends. And I think you named a few. First, it's igniting a necessary debate, I think, on sovereignty. Now, sovereignty doesn't mean inward-lookingness. It doesn't mean a protectionism or isolationism, but it does mean that on certain industry, on certain interests, we should have a political and strategic reckoning rather than only an economic one. And that's something I say in my book, that I think for Europeans, an economic approach to a lot of things that replaced a more a political one. And so now, you know, we're going through this debate I see on the question of health sovereignty, and whether it is sustainable for us to have outsourced most of our industrial capacities to Asia, to China, when it comes to manufacturing masks. or medicine. And so I think this is an important debate. I think it's also an important debate to to think about our dependency on some foreign markets, on supply chains. So we're going through this conversation. I think obviously another debate that has been accelerated by the pandemic is the question of China and the US-China rivalry. And I think that's also something on which you will see continuity on the vision, if not on the method, between the Trump administration and a potential Democratic administration. I think there's now a consensus, a pretty large consensus among American policymakers that the integration of China in the world economy has not led to a moderation of Chinese foreign policy or a opening of the Chinese political system, but actually quite the contrary. And so that the United States needs to have a strategy to reckon with China's rise, both to contain China's assertiveness in certain areas, but also find ways to cooperate, obviously, because in certain areas like tackling climate change, there's no unilateral solution. I think a big difference we will see, though, between the Trump administration and the potential Biden administration is the integration of allies in that strategy. The President Trump has been really focused on the bilateral relationship with Beijing, especially focused on the question of trade and rebalancing the U.S. trade deficits toward China through this negotiation with China. It's been one of the priorities of the president. We've seen a little bit of emphasis also on the question of Chinese technology in Europe, with obviously the question of 5G networks and some pressure on European allies. But I would say that all in all, it's been fairly uncoordinated, and I think there's been a huge missed opportunity when it comes to working with the European Union. You know, there was this just last week EU-China summit, and it's fascinating to see the shift of tone in the European Union over the relationship with China. It's been a summit that was mostly marked by disagreements. The question of human rights for Uyghurs, and obviously the question of Hong Kong was on the agenda. We still have very strong disagreements on the trade, and we've seen people like the Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, make the case for a level playing field and the ability to protect European industries from unfair competition. She didn't mention China, but everyone knew what she was thinking about. So we see similar concerns on privacy, on technology theft, on human rights in Europe that we see in the United States, but unfortunately there's no cooperation today. So I think another administration could reach out to Europeans and build common ground in this respect. But it's really interesting to see that these are trends that I think existed already before the pandemic, but have been put much more at the forefront of the debate in the last few months. Okay.
While reading your most recent articles, I came with the impression that you emphasize a lot on the prevalence of national actors. Where do you think that international institutions, international organizations such as the Council of Europe or the UN fit into this new world paradigm? I wouldn't put the European Union in the same category. Perhaps it's a little bit more different, but I would like your opinion on the international institutions that we grew up with.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think they're absolutely key. First, in terms of the technical cooperation on specific topics that they can promote, and both the Council in Europe, of Europe, and the UN in this respect are really critical in the norms that they can promote. And I think every academic, even the most realist one, will tell you that these norms do end up shaping behaviors of actors, and I think they're really critical. But it's true that a lot of those are also driven to a large extent by national actors, and we've seen. I'll give you a recent example. There was a debate at the beginning of the pandemic when the United States decided to defund and withdraw from the World Health Organization. I think that is a poor response to a question that was legitimate. The Trump administration denounced the poor performance, especially initially, the WHO and tackling the pandemic and sort of repeating some of the talking points that we were hearing from Beijing. But that is a consequence of U.S. withdrawal of these organizations. So the response to this, we need to shape an agenda of reform. We need to be clear when some of these institutions are failing. But the response to this is not to withdraw and let others fill the vacuum. It is to reinvest, reshape, and push a positive agenda of reform in these organizations. And I think that's something that unfortunately this administration has failed to do.
Okay. Going back to the pandemic, it seems that on the one hand, it has accelerated various processes on the international scene, but also it has liberated social forces in domestic political spheres in different countries all over the world, in different continents. How would you see the tension between democracy and authoritarianism playing out in the current conjuncture that we're going through?
So, it's interesting because I think the jury is still out on how we will assess this moment and sort of who won and who lost politically. Because initially, I remember in the very early stages in March and February, people said, this is going to be a moment for populists, for new authoritarian models. There was a big propaganda push by China, by Russia towards countries that are hard hit by the pandemic. I think we all remember the images of China sending masks to Italy. And same thing on the domestic level. We heard a lot of people saying that there was going to be this demand for protection, that this might be also a moment because of the economic crisis and tension, a moment for finding scapegoats. And foreigners or immigrants or minorities are often a convenient scapegoat in this context. But also that it could be a moment ripe for conspiracy theories and interference and disinformation, which is also something that's been very prevalent in our democracies and a force for neo-authoritarians in the last few years. But you know what? I don't think that's what happened. I think at the end of the day, we've seen democracies, and especially in the European Union, communicate fairly transparently. There's been a lot of improvisation. It's a completely unprecedented moment for political leaders. So there's been some mishaps, there's been some failures for sure. But what we've seen last summer is Europeans managing to agree on a historic recovery package. And so we've seen a moment of coordination and solidarity dominate the news. So this has not been, once again, we've heard this for 10 years now, that this is going to be the last crisis for the European Union and the collapse of Europeans. And it's exactly the opposite that is happening. You see, once again, the first few weeks were tough, but then you've seen the recovery package, and you've also seen a lot of just, I would say, more concrete solidarities with countries taking patients from across the borders and coordinating on masks and ventilators. So, in this respect, and same thing, I think the propaganda outreach from authoritarian states towards Europeans has been a little too overreaching, has fumbled a bit, and there's been a form of backlash that we've seen.
Okay. Speaking of Europe and
form of backlash that we've seen.
Speaking of Europe and the particular tradition of democratic values that it has been associated throughout the last 2 centuries at least, would you see that Europe still has the momentum it had supposedly in the past in order to export its values, or as someone else might term it, collaborate with other parts of the world? In the case of Southern Europe, we have the Mediterranean Sea, which can be a bridge of friendship and cooperation with other parts of the world. Where do you see Europe in that?
I think that first, when we look at what our democracies have been going through these last few years, it is a moment also for humility and listening to the message that voters has been sending. You can have a robust attachment to liberal and democratic values, but at the same time understand where there's been failures. And you can be pro-European and at the same time understand that because you're pro-European, you need to reform the European Union. If you look just at the last 10 years, we went through the Euro crisis, and the Euro crisis has shown that some of the instruments, the monetary instruments of the European Union were incomplete and needed to be reformed. We went through the migration crisis, and I think that the Schengen zone is one of the greatest successes of the European Union. But if you decide to abolish domestic borders, internal borders of the European Union, then you do need to invest significantly in ensuring external borders and supporting countries like Italy or like Greece that are at these borders. This is also one of the points I make in the book. The European Union should not be about transcending any kind of sovereignty. It should be about inventing a new kind of sovereignty and solidarity within the European Union, which means among Europeans, which means ensuring strong borders at the external edges of the EU. And so I think we've seen a message that's been sent, and some populist movements or far left, far right movements have conveyed this message in the political sphere, and we shouldn't dismiss it. Now, the question is, can we listen? Can we capture this demand, but shape it in a way that's compatible with a European ideal that doesn't give in to nationalism, that doesn't give in to xenophobia or isolationism, but it is compatible with a European liberal agenda. The United States has been going through the same issue. The 2016 election was also the result and the consequence of inequalities across the United States, of the fact that this country still has many issues to reckon with in terms of unequal access to healthcare, to infrastructure, the fact that 60 to 70,000 people a year are dying from drug addiction and the opioid crisis. The country is very dynamic and obviously extraordinarily innovative, but you have real also social ills that Donald Trump as a candidate managed to tap into and capture. So I think first that should be a really key issue is answer some of the demands and some of the ills of our citizens and the grievances. Now, that does not mean that we should be inward-looking or isolationist. I think we can continue to support the rule of law and to support the democratic paths of countries around us, especially when you see, the case of Belarus right now is particularly eloquent when you see an open, explicit demand for a change, for transition. I think the European Union needs to be able to send a message and support. And I really hope that the EU and the United States together will not lose a focus on this and continue to put pressure on the authorities in Belarus to make sure that the Belarusian society has different options and could look to a better future, because I think we've seen an extraordinary and very moving movement come out of this stolen election in the last month. But that doesn't preclude, I think, also looking at our own societies.
Okay. And speaking of our societies, while being in DC, you have the possibility to make some really excellent comparative assessments as to how social movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement is different in many respects, but at the same time ignites fascination among Europeans, and how the Black Lives movement the Black Lives Matter movement is translated into European politics, where traditionally racial inequalities haven't been that high on the agenda, especially in the French context, for example.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating thing for me to watch from the United States. So, I wrote a piece on this in Foreign Policy, comparing the movements on both sides of the Atlantic. First, one thing that struck me is during the first few months of the pandemic, during lockdown, there's been a lot of commentary saying this is the end of the American century, this is the beginning of the Asian moment, etc. And the truth is, when you see the first global event that ends lockdowns in many countries, and pushes many citizens to take the streets and send a message was the death and the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. And I think that's already a very powerful tale about the fact that whatever the president or the administration, the attachment to the link to American culture, to American societies and values all across the world, and especially in Europe, the bond is still very strong and will outlast, I think, any administration. And now it's been really interesting to see how this movement here in the United States and in the American context has resonated with Europeans. And when you look at the protests in Europe, first, some of them were directly linked to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter in the United States, and were a sign of solidarity with the movement. But we've also seen how that has connected to some situations at home. You mentioned France. In France, the march was both a Black Lives Matter march, but it was also a march on a specific French episode led by the family of Adama Traoré, who was a young man who died in police custody. So you can see that this also sends a message to our own domestic issues with race and identity. We don't talk about it the same way. France especially prides itself of being much more of a colorblind country. The word race was taken out of the Constitution last year, and this is something that came out of anti-racist movements in the left. To erase a sort of ugly word from the French vocabulary, Americans are much more comfortable with racial statistics, religious statistics, which are forbidden, for example, in France. So you have different social models on how to deal with it. But at the end of the day, I think both countries and both sides of the Atlantic have to reckon with the fact that there's still a deep, lingering discrimination and racism, and have a debate on how best to deal with it. And it's been really interesting to see how these two sides have connected in this.
Okay. We're moving on with a different question that is related with one of the priorities that our chairmanship, the Greek chairmanship, decided to put forward during the pandemic. It is digital policies and how this, in fact, can help alleviate a lot of the burdens that came up during the crisis. So it seems that, for example, again to go to a French example, President Macron had spoken some time ago of European sovereignty in artificial intelligence and security. Yet still, the issue of safeguarding the rule of law and individual freedoms in this domain is still debatable. Also vis-à-vis revisionist forces or rival continents, or whatever you might term this. So where do we stand on the relevance of digital policies in international relations today?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, it's interesting because first, this has been a key priority, as you know, of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, put digital sovereignty and digital issues at the heart of her presidency. This was already considered one of the biggest successes of the previous Commission, with the agenda that's been put forth by Margrethe Vestager, for example, on the question of taxation, content removal. We've seen GDPR, the norms that have been put forward on the protection of privacy by the European Commission, really influence the rest of the world. And now when you're in the United States and you go on the website, you have to click and approve the privacy rules that have been shaped by Europeans. So this is a really good example of normative power that the European Union has been able to assert on the world stage through its own technical and regulatory instruments. And I think this this was already a priority of Ursula von der Leyen, but it's made all the most urgent because of this, because of the fact that we're all on Zoom, on WebEx, on Teams, and we're hosting our meetings virtually with the question that it poses in terms of privacy, in terms of protection of content, the fact that the big tech companies have become even more influential in this crisis in our daily life, obviously. And so I think the fact that the European Union is pushing this agenda is really critical. You mentioned obviously the development of artificial intelligence and the norms and rules that are linked to it. And President Macron has been trying to chart a sort of middle way, third way between the development in the United States and China. In China, where it's really government control with key risks in terms of individual freedoms, and in the United States, where on the contrary, it's really being driven by major tech companies with very little regulation, with other concerns in terms of privacy. I think this is interesting to watch, and you see a lot of debates they're unfolding in the European Union. My sense is that it will be necessary, I think, to shape a consensus on with the United States in the next few years on these issues. On the question of taxation, for example, there's negotiations going on right now at the OECD, and I think it would be very constructive to be able to find some form of compromise. And that is because I think for the United States, on the one hand, there is a growing reckoning, growing understanding of the need to tackle these issues. And this is something that we've seen a lot, especially during the Democratic primary, with some candidates talking about antitrust measures and also talking about the question of content removal against hate speech, racism. But I think on the European side, it will be important first to work with the United States to build a common agenda, especially in the context of the rise of alternative authoritarian models, but also because it's important to make sure that this agenda does not stifle innovation. We talk about AI, for example, right now, the European Union is really lagging behind in terms of patents and innovation behind the United States, behind China, behind Israel. So the normative agenda should go hand in hand with also ambitious investments and an ambitious competitive and innovative policy.
Okay. One last question. So, in summing up, one could observe that human rights have been, over the last 50, 70 years, a constitutive part of the liberal order. They have even been instrumentalized in some cases, one might say. Would you say that they are still relevant in today's international politics? Conditionality clauses, are they upheld in regards to Europe's relations to neighboring states, or how we intend to promote universal values as a continent?
Yes, I'm absolutely convinced that they're still relevant, and I think that you see a debate that's maybe a little different from the one we had recently. But this is not only about spreading our values or being selfless defenders of the liberal order. There's also a strong, I would say, interested and realistic case for this. One theme that's really emerging right now in the United States and in Europe to a certain extent that I'm very interested in is the question of kleptocracy and the risks for our own sovereignty, for our own freedom in conducting our politics and foreign policy, of dirty foreign money coming from autocratic states being laundered in our democracies. You see this in the United States, at the City of London, and in European democracies. This is really a theme that has been emerging, and I think that will be more and more central in U.S. foreign policy in the next few years. So this is not only about projecting our values; this is also about protecting our own democracies. You see, obviously, a lot of more sophisticated methods when it comes to developing sanctions that do not target the population, but really focus on leaders, on oligarchs, on people who are really tied to murders or corruption. And we've seen a good example of this in the United States in the last few years has been the development by the U.S. Congress of the Magnitsky Act. And we're seeing some debate at the European Parliament going in that direction. So I think that our instruments, our tools are becoming more sophisticated also to defend transparency in the rule of law, while at the same time defending our own interests.
Okay. Lastly, as a realist, is there an inspiring message that you would like to share with us tonight before we put an end to this discussion?
Well, I will say what I said earlier, that when you look at the evolution of the European Union, especially in the last few years or just during this pandemic, sometimes some of the things that are happening are highly technical and they can be a little boring, from the regulatory instruments that are developed in digital policy to the massive recovery package that was adopted this summer. But we see an evolution, I think, in the right place in terms of solidarity. Let me give you another example. As you know, I'm a French citizen living in the United States, and I take the opportunity of speaking to a Greek audience to say that I think the evolution of the bilateral relationship between France and Greece in the last few months, and the stronger solidarity between the two countries in defending Greek sovereignty and international law in the Eastern Mediterranean is also really a strong step in the right direction for Europeans to assert their own sovereignty and identity on the world stage. So these things are not necessarily spectacular, but I think they're really a step in the right direction, and we're getting stronger.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ben, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. This was the 5th chapter of the In Discussion With series of the Greek chairmanship of the Council of Europe.